So early in the war, the Union Army essentially occupied a state that was technically loyal to the Union, but there were divided loyalties within the state. I mean, Germans lived throughout the state. There were people who were, in fact, slaveholders, but yet they were Unionists. They sincerely believed that the Union would best protect their slaves. Essentially, it would best protect slavery in Missouri. And in fact, Lincoln had indicated, at least in his words, that's what he intended to do. He was very desperate to keep Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland, the border states, the states that had not seceded from the Union, but yet were slave states. He desperately wanted to keep them in the Union. He was able to do that, but in all of those states, but especially in Kentucky and Missouri, there were people who supported secession as well. And as I indicated, some men went down and joined the Confederate Army in Arkansas from Missouri. Some ended up becoming guerrillas. And the Union Army, the Nathaniel Lyon and the whole series actually of commanders that were in charge of what was called the Department of the Missouri, out of St. Louis. They were very concerned about basically controlling the civilian population in the state of Missouri, because even though the Army had swept down through the state, had actually unseated, had sent on the run the duly elected governor of the state of Missouri, who was this, Governor Jackson, who was pro-South. They sent him and his government on the run down the Missouri River, down the western part of the state. There's a big battle at Wilson's Creek in that first year of the war. But ultimately, even though the Confederates win that battle and actually Lyon is killed, Jackson and his government and the Confederate forces in the state of Missouri are ultimately pushed out of the state. And they do raid into the state a couple of different times during the course of the war, the most famous being Price's raid. But ultimately there's not much of a official Confederate military presence here. And the Union Army has swept through the state, and they've established all these little garrisons in a lot of county seats. Not every county seat throughout the state. It's a little sparse, up in northern Missouri and in the Ozarks. But along the Missouri River, there's a garrison in every, and maybe sometimes two. In Jackson County, there's one at Westport, and there's one in Independence. And the idea is that they're going to be there to maintain the peace. But not unlike what's happened in our modern-day war, or wars, I should say, in the Middle East, the military can come through with all of its might, but it's really hard to, in modern-day language, to secure the minds and the hearts of the people, to bring them over to your side, especially if you're engaged in what they consider to be abusive policies, which is going and arresting men that they deem disloyal to the Union, taking their property away from them. The Southern supporting people were they absolutely hated and vilified the German Americans who were making up, not wholesale all the people in the Union Army in the state of Missouri. In fact, in the first year of the war, they were bringing in troops from other places, but they were from, of course, northern places. But they vilified them. They couldn't stand them. They called them dirty Dutch, because they were Deutsch, but they called them Dutch, and they said horrible things about them if you read what they wrote about them. And so they they very much disliked the people who they thought were against them. And of course, some of those people were living among them in their communities. And so what ends up happening is this just nasty guerrilla warfare erupts in the state and along the border. So it's going over into Kansas as well, some. But really during the Civil War itself, most of the violence, with the exception of that horrific raid on Lawrence, is happening in Missouri. You know, this is the time where Missourians are really suffering, and because they had divided loyalties, and oftentimes people weren't sure who to trust, they would get themselves into really precarious positions. You know, it becomes about halfway through the war, it becomes increasingly difficult for white men to remain in the state, you know, depending on their location and what was happening with guerrilla activity there. You know, Unionists and secessionists were at risk. You know, it was not unusual for men to, you know, for somebody to show up at their door and drag them out in the middle of the night and hang them from the nearest tree, you know, burn down their houses. There was a lot of talk among the guerrillas especially that they did not brutalize women, but yet, you know, in this sort of this, I would call it false code of chivalry that they created for themselves. If you read what they wrote after the war, they may not be physically attacking white women, I should clarify, because they were sometimes African American women, but they were burning down their homes and they were taking away their livelihood. They were killing their men and sometimes even, you know, their teenage sons. So it was, you know, which is of course what happened in Lawrence, and I don't think that's, you know, that was very chivalric. You know, it was not chivalry to go into Lawrence and you know, kill a bunch of unarmed citizens. But the problem, of course, with guerrilla warfare is that you don't know who is a civilian and who is an insurgent. And the way that guerrilla warfare operates is that households have to support the insurgency. The guerrillas are way far away from any kind of Confederate supply lines. In fact, they're not even officially recognized by the official Confederate Army. There's a little bit of a wink and a nod sort of thing going on where they know what they're doing. I mean, sometimes they're a little bit troubled by some of their tactics, but yet they know that they help them out, and so they don't tell them to stop, essentially. And you know, the Confederate Army can't touch Missouri because they're so far away, and so they let these guerrillas basically do what they will. But they're not supplied by the Army, so how they have to supply themselves is to either hit Unionist civilians and take their stuff from them, or attack little detachments of Union soldiers, which is certainly one of their major focuses, as they, you know, one of the main things that they do. But they also are supported by their own women and children. So there is a network of households that guerrillas know are safe houses, and they go to those houses for their supplies. So certainly for fodder for their horses, sometimes to give them a fresh horse, although it became very difficult to keep good horses in especially western Missouri during the war, because they were constantly being confiscated by one side or the other. And to feed them and to provide them with shelter, especially in the wintertime. So the Union Army knows this. They're totally perplexed by what's going on. They have a tendency to look at anyone who they think is Southern or of Southern origins as the enemy, even sometimes the Unionist slaveholders, because certainly if people own slaves, then they're going to assume that they're supporting the South. People lied all the time to try to protect themselves, and so they knew that as well. And so I think that the Union Army, the official Union Army, and then later on the Home Guard units, which were a little bit more locally based, as the Union Army basically takes a lot of the actual soldiers out of the state of Missouri and sends them to Tennessee, for example, or down to Louisiana, where a lot of the action is.